Yeah, great. And I'll just go a little bit fast so that we have time for Brandon. But hi, everybody. My name is Amemiya. I'm a postdoc at UC San Diego and the University of Chicago. And today I'll be discussing my work from my cog sci paper in combination with some other work together entitled The Role of Alternatives in Children's Reasoning About Constrained Choices. So understanding the mental lives of other people, such as inferring their preferences, depends on the ability to reason about constraints. So the choices we observe other people make, for example, what toys or what careers they choose, mean something very different depending on whether there were many options readily available versus very few options. Constrained choices are ambiguous with respect to a person's preference. We can't be clear whether they made their choice because of a desire or because that was what was available to them. So developmental research suggests that children are sensitive to constraints starting early in life. To give you a sense of a traditional constraint paradigm, imagine that you're this child observer in the purple shirt, and you see this girl across from you and notice that there are two toys. A yellow toy on the left shorter shelf that she is able to reach, and a more colorful ball on the right taller shelf that she is unable to reach. If she takes the yellow ball, what can you infer about her preferences? And because she was constrained to this option, such that she could only reach this one, you should in theory refrain from inferring that she prefers the yellow ball because it's unclear as to whether she actually likes it more. She just was taking what was available. Now, the capacity to consider constraints in this way emerges in infancy and becomes even more robust through childhood. For example, by 5 to 6 years of age, children refrain from inferring preferences even when observing just one single constrained action. But when considering constraint reasoning in adulthood, many scholars have written about how adults are often not sensitive to constraints when reasoning about the social world. For example, adults regularly appeal to intrinsic explanations for group differences and inequalities, despite societal constraints. So in the present study, we sought to answer the question, are children especially sensitive to constraints, or do features of the developmental task scaffold constraint reasoning? And so I'll argue that features of the task facilitate attention to constraints, and that identifying these features may also help to explain why adults are less sensitive to constraints. So returning back to this paradigm, so I'll propose that there are different alternatives, so ways that the situation could have been different to consider that affect constraint reasoning and the judgments that we make. On the one hand, alternatives can be focused on constraints in the environment, specifically that the environment could have provided greater choice. And previous work suggests that children are focused on this alternative. So had the environment been different and offered greater choice, maybe she wouldn't have chosen that toy, and therefore I can't be sure that she likes it. On the other hand, alternatives can be focused on the individual, specifically that the individual could have tried harder for the other option. And given that she didn't try harder, we can be certain that she likes what she took. So I'll argue that the designs of some previous studies have pushed children to more strongly consider the environmental alternative, but that common narratives in American culture may push children to more strongly consider the individual alternative. And these studies were inspired by previous work cited below in other domains, finding that children's inferences can shift depending on the alternatives that are made salient to them. So how have studies put an emphasis on the environment? As one example, in a paradigm used by Pozowski and colleagues with 5 to 6-year-olds, the selected toy the character took from the lower shelf was less attractive than the toy that was out of reach. It was a smaller, less exciting castle that she took. And so this violation of expectation, the fact that she selected this worst option, may have led children to consider that had both castles been on the lower shelf, the choice may have been different, thus leading children to refrain from inferring that she likes this option. Another study by Hara Edinger and colleagues may have also drawn children's attention to the constraint, here by presenting variation in constraints. So here children were shown what treat the character Ernie chooses in a constrained and an unconstrained environment. For example, he chooses the watermelon when constrained to that option, but the banana when unconstrained. And by showing variation in the environment, children may notice that selections change depending on the level of choice that is provided, and then recognize they have poor evidence of Ernie's preferences in the constraint scenario. And to draw an analogy between this study and some recent social commentary on inequality, there are images such as these that represent differential constraints groups experience. So for example, that women have more constraints in the workplace than men, which ultimately may explain their outcomes. So to answer whether children are robust in their sensitivity to constraints, we remove both of these scaffolds and examine if they still successfully refrain from inferring preferences. So children in our sample were ages 5 to 12 years old. And for the purposes of the results here, I'll collapse across age and not be talking about age differences, but happy to answer questions in the Q&A. So the first study condition was a conceptual replication of Pasowski et al., in which children observed constrained actors take less attractive toys. So children first observed two agents select the smaller, less colorful toy from the shelf they can reach from. And then in the test trial, which was that final third trial, they reasoned about a girl named Cody, who also takes the less attractive toy from the bottom shelf. And the test question is, does Cody like the selected toy more than the unselected toy? The second condition was a replication of Har-Ettinger et al. Here, the toys are back to being equally attractive, but now the first two stories before the test trial are about unconstrained actors who are freely able to choose their toys, to then emphasize the greater choice that Cody's environment, the last actor, could have provided. The third novel condition, no scaffolds, gets rid of both scaffolds. So all actors were choosing a toy that was equally attractive as the constrained toy, and participants only observed constrained choices prior to observing the final test trial. And we expected that without scaffolds of selecting the less attractive toy or variation in the constraints, children would be more likely to infer that the final actor, Cody, likes what she chose, despite the fact she was constrained to that option. So I'll first orient you to this graph. So on the x-axis are the three conditions. So the less attractive scaffold, the very constrained scaffold, and critically, the no scaffolds condition. And recall that the dependent measure was always children's reasoning about the third and final story of Cody, who took the toy from the lower shelf. And on the y-axis is the proportion of children saying that, yes, Cody likes the selected toy. If children robustly attend to constraints, the bar should be low across all three conditions. But if we're right, children may infer a preference more in the no scaffolds condition relative to the two others. So let's take a look at the first condition. So replicating the Pasowski finding, on average, children tend to refrain from inferring a preference when Cody takes the less attractive toy. And similarly, in the next condition, we find a similar pattern where children are refraining from inferring that Cody likes the selected toy. And now let's turn to the critical no scaffolds condition that removes both scaffolds. And we see that in contrast to previous literature, but in line with their hypotheses, many more children now infer that Cody likes what she took, despite the fact that she was clearly constrained. So to summarize, study 1 suggests that children's reasoning about constrained choices depends on whether the environment alternative is made salient. Notably, either type of scaffold was sufficient, so making the constrained choice less attractive, or showing variation in constraints recovered children's tendency to consider constraints and refrain from inferring preferences. So now let's consider the individual alternative that I brought up earlier. So we found that in study 1, children refrain from inferring that Cody here likes this less attractive ball that she took. However, what if instead children had the following alternative in mind? That Cody, the individual, could have tried harder to get the toy on the taller shelf. So many stories that American children and adults are exposed to, such as The Little Engine That Could, include messages about persistence, hard work, and defying the odds that may put this kind of alternative at the forefront of children's minds. And persistence is not just seen in children's storybooks, but it is also commonly celebrated. For example, we have movies celebrating individuals who break societal barriers, overcoming racial and gender discrimination. And we ask here, could emphasizing examples of persistence in the face of constraints affect how children reason about those who do not overcome their constraints? And so like study 1, we included children 5 to 12 years of age. So our baseline condition was an all environment scaffolds condition. So the toy the final actor Cody selected was less attractive, and the actors before did not experience constraints. So we then can compare this to a persistence successful condition. So this condition had the same exact test trial in which Cody took the less attractive toy. But critically, children were told about 2 other students who worked hard to successfully get the toy from the taller shelf, jumping 3 times and getting the better one. And therefore, the alternative that Cody could have tried harder to get the multicolored ball is put in the front of children's minds. And the fact that she didn't could mean that she's happy with what she took. And now one alternative explanation, if we find the pattern that children infer preferences more here, maybe all we did was just show that the shelf isn't a real constraint. And so it's just about showing that it's actually easy to get the other toy rather than it's something about effort. So to address this issue, we included a persistence failed condition in which the characters before Cody also tried to get the other toy by jumping 3 times, but critically they failed to get it. And so here, the difficulty of reaching the other toy is emphasized, but so still is the alternative that Cody could have tried harder to get it. So here again are the 3 conditions, overlaying the same kind of graph I showed before. And I've outlined in red the test stories. So when all environment scaffolds were provided, few children said Cody likes what she took. However, in the persistent successful condition, which showed the 2 previous actors successfully overcoming constraints through their efforts, children now inferred, the majority of them inferred that Cody likes what she took. But we wanted to make sure that this is something about persistence, not just about the outcome. And we've seen the same pattern in the persistence failed condition. The majority of kids are now saying that Cody likes what she took. So study 2 finds that children's reasoning about constrained choices also depends on whether an individual alternative is made salient. And stories about persistence, even failed attempts at persistence, may lead children to assume that constrained actors who do not persist must prefer the options they have currently. So in conclusion, these studies provide initial evidence that children's reasoning about constrained choices is malleable. It's impacted by what alternatives are in mind. So here we explored whether the environment could have provided greater choice or whether the individual could have tried harder. And we conclude that if certain narratives, such as persistence narratives, are emphasized on average more than others, such as narratives about some people having greater privileges or choice than other people, this may lead children to focus more on the individual than the environmental alternative. And given that American culture tends to emphasize persistence, these findings may help to explain why many children and adults privilege intrinsic explanations for disadvantage and group differences. So in future work, we'll explore if emphasizing different alternatives in this way affects children's and adults' judgments about individuals and groups facing stable real-world constraints. So I'll just end here with the take-home message and wanted to say thank you to all participating families, my research assistants, collaborators, Dr. Gail Heyman and Dr. Karen Walker, and thank you so much for listening.